Yeah, but I think one key difference is that humans are accountable. Machines aren't accountable, right? And so I think that's part of it. It's about trust. And, if we undermine trust, then we've lost our greatest value. And I think there have been enough hits to trust in the news industry over the last decade. We don't need to exacerbate that.
Hello, and welcome to the Media Copilot. It's a podcast that explores how AI is changing media, journalism, and content creation. I'm Pete Pachal, longtime tech journalist and the founder of the Media Copilot, and I'm excited to bring you fascinating conversations with fellow journalists, media executives, and the people building how the business of news will work in the future. This week, I welcome Troy Thibodeaux to the podcast. Troy is director of AI products and services for the Associated Press, and he's been mixing AI and news since well before ChatGPT was a thing. As the AP's head of AI experiences, Troy has his eyes firmly fixed on the future. How our audience is changing, and more importantly, how are their expectations changing now that AI search platforms like ChatGPT, Perplexity, and Google AI Mode are now a daily habit for millions of people. Like every other newsroom, the AP is being forced to adapt to those changing habits, but the company is actually in a pretty unique position among its peers in the media. If you think about it, the AP is kind of a news wholesaler already, given that it makes its reporting available to newsroom partners worldwide. So it doesn't have quite the same set of concerns when you think about readers who are demanding, say, instant news summaries or synthetic podcasts based on the news. The main challenge, as ever, is ensuring the information doesn't lose integrity, something Troy and I explore quite a bit. So, how does the AP approach so called liquid content, which is the new term for when AI remixes stories into different formats? What are the red lines for the AP when it comes to using AI? And how are the journalists there adapting to all of this? We get into all of it. I hope you find the conversation illuminating. And if you do, I'd encourage you to share it with a friend or a colleague. I'd also be grateful if you'd consider subscribing to the Media Copilot newsletter if you haven't already. Links in the show notes. Just a couple of notes. First, I'm offering a monthly class on AI for beginners. It's only 60 minutes, and like everything I do, it's focused on practical takeaways for media professionals, people in journalism, PR, communications. And it's only $49. Each one is a live class, so it's always up to date, and I guarantee you'll walk away with something you can apply to your day to day. You can sign up at mediacopilot.ai. Also, for deeper, more comprehensive training, I'm offering 2 extended courses in the fall. Each one lasts 6 weeks, and one is for journalists, and the other is for PR and comms. These are loaded with lessons on things like deep research, how to automate workflows, and building your own AI agent. There's tons of live workshopping, plus, you get to do a project that's personalized for you, so you're guaranteed to upgrade the way you work. You can sign up for those courses at where else? Mediacopilot.ai. Oh, and there was a technical snafu with my video on this particular podcast, and that's why I look so low res if you're watching on YouTube or Spotify, and also why I probably explode into a cloud of pixels here and there. I'm sorry if that bothers you. Just go ahead and keep your eyes on Troy the whole time, and you should do fine. Now back to the show and my conversation with Troy Thibodeaux, Director of AI Products and Services for the Associated Press. Troy, welcome to the Media Copilot.
Pete, thanks for having me.
Amazing. I'm super happy you're here. I know you've been building things at the AP for quite a while. Your title, I looked it up on LinkedIn, is Director of AI Products and Services at the Associated Press, which sounds like really one of the most influential jobs you might have in news media, considering how AI seems to be rewriting everything these days. So obviously, the AP is a huge organization. It's apparently used by more than 15,000 media outlets, has over 3,000 employees. Stats I got that from ChatGPT, so maybe maybe a little off. You tell me. But I also know you guys have been doing AI stuff for a long time, even since before generative AI. So when it was more sort of templated stuff, data lakes, etc. You were also, the AP was one of the first licensing partners, the first licensing partner of OpenAI, which we can talk about. So there's a lot of ground to cover here. But I'd love to start with you. So you've been at the AP for quite a while. Tell me, like, what is the through line that's been connecting sort of the earlier data work that you've done and the current focus here in the generative AI era?
Yeah, I think a lot of my career has been at the intersection of technology and journalism. And I want to think about ways that we can use technology to support our journalism. And so whether that was building out the data team and the interactives and news applications team, we're really thinking about, how do we do news on the web? What are the capabilities that this brings for us? And then, leading the digital news organization, kind of getting that into shape and kind of putting a formal organization around that was really about how AP can learn from creating its own B2C. How do we serve our customers better? We're primarily a B2B, but
Right.
how do we use this technology in a way that we learn from it, so that we can make our product better for the B2B customers? And then now the next evolution of that, I want to think about. I want to be constantly learning. I want to be thinking about how technology can help us now. And I think the big area obviously now is AI. And so a couple of years ago, I really took on that focus.
Nice. Yeah, it's. I like how you brought up the web right away because I know there's sort of a lot of concern now with how AI is changing everything, particularly with regards to how people are getting information. And I feel like that makes it quite a bit different from any other sort of technological change into sort of news distribution, right? I think I don't mean to sort of trivialize all the things that happened in the last 10 years. There's been a lot of different ways, things have changed with search and social. And I feel like it all sort of was ultimately at the end of the day sort of bringing people to your site or your platform. And I think the AP is interestingly positioned here because as sort of the B2B, um as more of a B2B player, because there's this theory that my friend Brian Morrissey likes to put out there and talks about how like content creators and news creators or journalistic operations in particular are sort of going to become like wholesale distributors of information almost, where these AI engines will ingest it and sort of serve it up to people in a in whatever form they want, really. So I might be sort of going a little fast here in terms of like talking about what AI means to the ecosystem, but I'm curious about that. Like, how do you see that evolving in terms of like how people AI is changing how people are getting information? Are you better positioned because of that B2B focus that you kind of already a wholesale supplier of information in a sense?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. We license content. It's one of the ways that it's our business model. And so thinking about that in the AI age, I think we did have kind of an advantage there. Something that we've done before. But I do think that information consumption is changing and that news consumer expectations are changing. And I think that's an exciting time, but it's also really challenging. And if you think about what a news website means, um, and if you're saying, maybe, AI agents are going to be, rather than the individual coming to your website, now an AI agent is coming to your website,
Right.
that change the way you think about it. But I still think it does come back to those experiences that we can create. Right?
Mhm.
What is the experience that a news provider can create, that a tech platform can't? What are the things that we can do that are specific to us that serve a specific audience? And thinking about ways that we can use personalization, that we can use AI to really create news specific experiences that have real value for the news consumer. I mean, their expectations are changing in a way that the inverted pyramid story, I don't think is going to serve them. If you think about kind
Mhm.
of like a unit of meaning is going to be, right? So the unit of meaning is not going to be the article. Right now, the unit of
Mhm.
meaning is changing. It's the answer to my question. It's the conversation that I want to have. How do we create that?
Yeah, it's funny, like the unit of information. I take your point because articles like it's always been the default thing because text is just so easy. You sit down, you write something, and you have content, and hopefully you have good information and a good writing ability, and it's something sellable, and that's how obviously the whole industry works. But now, like I always sort of think of like the unit of information. I think I always have as like the story, right, as opposed to the article. And so then that once you sort of make that adjustment, you're like, okay, hold on, maybe the story could be one sort of key piece of information or a bunch of them strung together or what have you, right? And then once you sort of think about it in that sense, like it becomes sort of much more malleable. And I think what this is sort of manifesting as in the AI era is something I call it like a content polymorph, but I think it's more broadly thought of as liquid content. You know
Hmm.
what I mean? Have you heard the term?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's kind of like, you have an article that tells a story, and then AI comes in and hopefully with some good engineering on teams like yours and some human oversight, you can turn that into like a podcast or some videos or what have you. What are your thoughts on the whole idea of liquid content? Are you guys serving up things like that? I know like a bunch of organizations like Time and others are now doing audio in this sense, right? They'll do a Gen AI audio overview. I think BI does one too. And it's kind of like doing the Notebook LM thing, right? Which is another sort of example of liquid content. What do you think? Is this basically the future for news experiences?
I think there's a lot to that. If you think about the experience of writing an article, and I love the distinction you make between the story and the article, because I think story is an overloaded term for us, right?
Sure.
Story also means article, but the story is the whole arc of the news event, right? And thinking about that, I think offers a lot of opportunities. If you think about where someone is coming into that story, what their context is, what their level of engagement is, the idea should be we don't have to serve everyone the same story, right? But we can actually engage with them at the level of interest and knowledge that they have. And so I think that's something that we're thinking about a lot, because
Mm.
think about all the things that end up on the cutting room floor. There's lots of video, there's lots of text. If you think about every time as a writer, your editor is making you cut for length. What could we do with that? If we could have access to that, if AI could have access to that in a way that still maintained that editorial oversight. And that really is the challenge thing. But so we're looking at different things. There's a new feature on our B2B platform called Storylines that I think is pretty interesting, because you can come in and see, here's the big story of the day, using story in that kind of story writ large sense. And then rather than just seeing a single video for it, it actually goes through all the video that we have about that story, and it develops different angles, different
Mm.
storylines that you may want to use. And if you think about it, your audience is going to be interested in a different angle, a different storyline, subset of this story. So it really helps you target that aspect, that angle. And I think that sort of kind of personalization, ways of, pulling from that larger
Mm.
volume of content, that kind of, this kind of liquid approach really allows us to serve news consumers much more effectively.
Give me more about like what you think of and see as the personalization phase of this. Obviously, first party data comes into play here. How much do you know about the person, and then adapt the experience to them. But as you mentioned, sort of as a more of a B2B history, what is sort of your infrastructure there in terms of getting that sort of information, and have you just tell me like how that factors into the AP strategically, I guess.
Right. Well, so we assume that our members and customers know their audience better than we do,
Right.
right? And so we want to provide them the tools and the content that they can use to better serve that audience. And so, are there ways that we can make our content more flexible, like the storyline feature, right? Are there ways that we can provide more rather than having to say, here's a box that you have to fit into your website, right? Here are the materials, here are the capabilities you can use. So that involves tooling, it involves different kinds of content, and it does involve kind of different versions of the content we're producing. And I think about that in terms of how much time journalists have spent traditionally doing different versions of the same story. If you think about it, there's the story itself, there's the story that you turn into your editor, there's a story that actually gets published, there's the headline, that's another version of that story, there's a summary of that story, there's maybe a bullet summary, there's an SEO headline, a short headline. These are all versions of things. And think about it, you can do an audio version of it, there's a video version of it. So if that versioning can be assisted by AI, and we can provide different flavors, different versions of that story that work best for our members and customers audiences, they can then make those crucial decisions about how to serve those audiences better.
Yeah, and I also find that aspect of AI, that sort of I don't know if I'm always invent terms on every podcast, but the micro reversioning, I would guess you might call it, of coming up with headlines, SEO descriptions, uh, offloading that to a bot tends to be a good persuasive thing to on the ground reporters and editors who honestly never really wanted to do that kind of stuff in the first place. I find most reporters really just want to report. They want to write the one story and move on to the next one. They don't want to spend a lot of time thinking about like what I call sort of the content marketing of their stories. Um, So that gives a good transition to sort of turning the lens a little bit inward. So we've been talking about audience experiences and liquid content. And one of the more intriguing things you mentioned is sort of like what's on the cutting room floor, and can we take things like reporter notes and the entirety of their interviews and put them all into this story background that can then serve it up depending on what the audience wants and what sort of products we build around it. How do journalists feel about that? What is sort of the general vibe at the AP there in terms of the staff, and how they're embracing AI or perhaps reluctantly using AI? There's probably a spectrum, as there is at every, like, certainly no organization as large as yours. But how do you think about this sort of inevitable thing, this wave that's passing over all of us of AI, and a profession that may feel simultaneously existentially threatened, intrigued, but also very cautious and skeptical? How do you manage that?
Yeah, and when we first started off, and I first got this job, and I did a town hall about it, and I got a lot of tough questions from journalists. Is AI going to take my job? Is it going to undermine our standards? And so, right from the beginning, one of the things that we did was we tried to make sure that the newsroom was involved from the beginning with every idea, that we're serving the needs that they helped identify. And then as we iterate through a proof of concept and a pilot, it's the newsroom who's telling us, is this working? Does it work for you? Because if it's not working for the journalists, it's not working. At the same time, right from the beginning, we brought in the standards team. And we set some guardrails right up front and said, generative imagery is a red line for us. We're not going to be doing that. We said we're not going to actually provide any generative content directly to users, directly to readers. Everything is going to have an editor reviewing it, approving it, vetting it, improving it, throwing it out if it doesn't meet our standards, right? So having those guardrails in place up front and having that newsroom participation, I think really helped. So we started off with this kind of conversation of, this is an existential threat. This is going to violate our standards. And then a year later, we had another follow-up. And really the questions were, can we do more with this? What can we do next? And I feel like there has been kind of a shift. As people get their hands on it, they see its usefulness, they see its limitations. And if we design these applications so that they're augmenting the journalists, and we've never set out to replace them, I think if you set out to replace journalists with AI, you're heading down a bad path. And so I think that kind of comfort level has massively improved over the last year or two.
So, the subject of like bias, which is to say media bias, real or imagined, has sort of come up recently in some, well, in various stories. And but what's happened recently is that people are sometimes seeing AI as a potential tool in perhaps identifying and maybe sometimes even correcting for it. This is obviously a dicey subject, often in newsrooms, but it's definitely something that continues to have interest. Certainly, sites that are explicitly about measuring that are using it, and there's been some experimentation here and there. I know before it folded, the Messenger was interested in doing something like this with AI. I'm curious. Like, I know the AP is not really at the forefront of being accused of these kind of things. But there's probably you certainly see the same stories that I do. I'm just curious if you apply AI in any way in that sense, and if not, what are your thoughts on it potentially being a tool to correct for that in stories where it might be appropriate?
Yeah, we've rolled out ChatGPT Enterprise to a number of folks across the AP, and one of the experiments that they did was to look at perceived bias in a story. And I think the way that they implemented it was really interesting. Right? It's not rewrite this story so it can't be perceived as being biased. It's identify what different audiences may see as bias in here, and
Mm.
then it's still an editorial decision. Right? Whether or not you make that change, whether or not you respond to that perceived bias. But it's a tool to help us understand audiences and their perceptions better. We've asked it questions, which in this article, which communities affected by this topic are not represented in the story itself, right? So I think there are ways that we can use AI to help us understand what could be perceived as bias, ways to help us better serve diverse audiences. And so I think using AI to help support our standards and our principles, I think that does a lot to counter the fear that it's going to undermine our standards.
Nice. So zooming out a bit on other, just more generally about how to apply AI tooling or process in the newsroom. Um, I recently interviewed Jane Barrett over at Reuters, and I think they're kind of probably the most closest to the AP in terms of like what the size and scale and goals of their operations. And she articulated that they sort of have a it's almost like a bucketed approach, or maybe I guess you could think of it as a phased approach when they're applying like AI processes. And she said it was like they think about them, is it reduce, augment, or transform? And it's like, are you sort of reducing the amount of work that AI is sort of taking in a task and giving time back to journalists? Are you augmenting their work in some way? Which is to say, is it somehow better, but measurably, by introducing AI into the process? Or transform? Are you doing entirely new things, or at least mostly new things, and opening up maybe opportunities for storytelling or even business units by using the technology? Do you think about it that way? Is that I mean, do you have a structure that's similar? I'm just curious.
Yeah, I think we have similar kinds of buckets that we talk about. So we think about AI infused products. These are largely features or entire products that could not have existed without AI. And we look at newsroom automation, which is kind of that reduce bucket, right? So what are the ways that we can take tasks that are time consuming and maybe that journalists don't see as journalism, out of their way. Or at least make it easier to do those faster. And then kind of overall efficiency bucket. So thinking across the enterprise, I think that there are some back office functions that could really use AI in ways that are less risky than trying to publish something that uses AI. So kind of looking at the efficiency, newsroom automation, and then AI infused products. Those are the kind of the buckets that we work with.
And as you're sort of applying things and finding these efficiencies, introducing processes, as and potentially, particularly in the efficiency sort of reduce bucket, like what are the things you measure? Like how do you sort of go like, oh wow, that's working, this is great because I don't know, reporters are just doing more stories now, or they're better, or they got more reach. I don't know, obviously depends on the thing, but again, what's your, how do, when you sort of go into one of these things and you're piloting it, et cetera, like what are the things you look at and when you decide it's working or not working?
Yeah, so with each project, we're going to have different success metrics and at different stages. So we'll have a POC phase where we really want to do the least technical thing that can possibly work. Let's prove out the feasibility of this, right? And so we set a certain metric there to say, with a smaller group of testers, this is working consistently at a level that they feel is useful. Sometimes we'll do sort of a 5-point scale, right? This is something that's unpublishable to something it's nearly publishable as is, right? And if we can hit that sort of 3 sweet spot, which we define as this is useful to me as a journalist, then we feel like it's ready to kind of move on to that next phase and pilot it. But each of these projects is going to have different success metrics, especially in production. So, for example, with Spanish translations, we knew from our customers that they really wanted a greater volume of Spanish language content. And we have a small number of translators. So how could we help those translators be more productive? And really what happened with the AI translations is we helped move folks who were translators really into more of a translation editor role. So they're able to work more quickly. They've got that first draft done. And then they're really adding the things that are that go beyond the word for word translation. They're adding cultural context. They're evaluating, they're vetting it for accuracy, all those sort of editorial functions. But then we can measure our Spanish language content increases by 40%. That's, so the volume metric was there. Other things we're looking at more consistency, if we're trying to serve better summaries especially for broadcast customers. are we following our own broadcast guidelines? Are we going to create something that's more useful for them and for their medium? So different projects will have different metrics, but we have success metrics for all of them.
And what is your overall sense as you introduce these things? It sounds like some of those might be replacing some tasks, and some of those might actually be creating new jobs, depending on what the project is. What is the sense that you have on like how it's affecting employment overall? I guess maybe maybe project out to the industry of it. I know you might not want to say too much about what's going on internally, but it feels like AI is obviously transforming jobs and how we're doing our work. Everyone's kind of worried that we might not find other work, but like I say, as you were just describing that, it did sound like, well, there's got to be some human in the loop jobs for those new things you're creating. Is it more of a just transforming roles, or is it sort of reducing them as well?
That's what we've seen. We have not set out to reduce headcount in any of these projects, right? We're not going to use AI to replace a journalist. I do think that I have seen some examples of organizations trying to do that, and it really hasn't ended well. So I think our journalists are our key value. And so we're never setting out to reduce headcount using AI. However, jobs do change. If you're not creating five different versions of a story, what can you do now? What are
Hmm.
the things that what does that next story look like? Or if you're talking about the digital news team, if they're not creating these summaries, or they've got better options to get to more engaging headlines faster, what other kinds of tasks can they take on? And so it kind of expands our capacity. And really, I think that's where we've been focused, shifting responsibility, kind of shifting tasks, and especially the tasks that are time consuming and less rewarding. If we can shift some of those to the machine, how do we open up the potential for new kinds of tasks and new kinds of journalism?
Um, Shifting focus a bit, like I mentioned early on, the AP was OpenAI's very first news content partner. Um, and I'm curious how that's going. I'm not sure how involved you were personally in that, but I'm curious. What did the AP see in a partnership like that maybe others were a little more hesitant on? And then now that it's been, wow, like I guess almost 2 years since that first deal was signed, how has things evolved in terms of the partnership, if you can say, or just how you guys are using the technology?
Yeah, I think our comfort level there may have been a little different from some other news organizations just because of the nature of our licensing business. Right? This is what we do. It's our business model. It's a huge part of it. And so the revenue team was able then to negotiate a licensing deal based on their experience. Obviously, AI is a new area, and kind of identifying what that opportunity looks like was new, but it still was, had so much in common with all the other kinds of licensing deals that we've done. I think that probably gave us a greater comfort level. The
Mm.
you know the
It's
the
not it's
base
not like the same "don't cannibalize our audience" thing that I think a lot of people were concerned about, but obviously, you were far from the last of these deals, so people seem to have gotten over that a little bit too.
Right, and, the bottom line here is that we expect to be paid for our content.
Mm.
It's content. This is expensive. Real journalism is expensive to produce, and we need to be paid for it. And so that was a contention we brought in, and I think that sort of sets a standard and an expectation. I think it's a good thing. That relationship has gone on. We've done some other things with them. We worked with them on the Operator project, and thought about some journalism use cases for that. We're using OpenAI, using their API for a lot of the projects that we're doing, and so that's been really helpful. And then rolling out, ChatGPT Enterprise to folks across the organization, I think that's been really interesting for us because often we come into these things and we have kind of a top-down view. Here are the strategic goals, and here are the ways that we think that it can benefit the business. But getting the technology into people's hands and having them discover ways that can be useful can help us think about, all right, how might we operationalize that? How might we take this one experiment that someone did and provide it to a larger segment of the staff? So, we're working with them in lots of ways still.
Since you guys are partners and obviously you use the API and their tools, um, Does that ever make you worry that you might be overlooking alternatives? Like, there's a lot of models out there. A lot of people predict that they're getting commoditized. Maybe they are, maybe they're not. I don't know. I'd love your perspective on that. But does it do you guys do experiment with other models? How do you think about the broad world of AI and what's available to you vis-a-vis the partnership?
Yeah, that's really part of the very early stage of these projects. We're evaluating different models always. All things being equal, we have gone with OpenAI when all things were equal, because it made sense because of that partnership. But we're looking not only at different LLMs, but we're looking at models that aren't LLMs. Right? What are other kinds of machine learning models? Because I think because large language models are a general purpose kind of solution, people tend to just say, okay, this here, we have an AI use case, we've got an automation use case, let's grab an LLM and try it out. But our data science team is really looking at what are the other kinds of models that could be less expensive, that we could run on our own architecture, that we could use for specific use cases. So we're always evaluating different LLMs, different models, but also different types of technology solutions to really find the right tool for the task.
So yeah, you mentioned earlier that you expect to be paid for your content. I think that's shared by a lot of folks, if not everyone in media. That said, there's a lot of indications out there that that's actually not happening. There's a lot of AI crawling. It's very much on the rise. Recent industry data is showing that. Certainly, you're a large organization. Again, we were one of the first partners, but there that seems to be only available to these larger media organizations. Um, and now we're seeing companies like Cloudflare. I don't know if you saw the news the other day, but now they're going to, in their infrastructure, their network, they're going to block AI crawling by default. So there's a lot of almost like I guess a consensus forming about sort of it being a little more um, like if you do take content via AI, it's more of a syndication relationship than a search, which is sort of where it evolved from. Um, so given that, like, I guess, how does AP protect your content from bots? Like, what is the first, how do you do that? And then how do you see this area, this I guess split between AI companies and media companies evolving in the coming months?
Yeah, we have the usual protections in place. Our legal team is certainly taking care of that. We've seen crawlers, we've seen bots that how they identify themselves, whether or not they identify themselves appropriately. So there's a constant conversation about that, about how we kind of manage that. But then sort of thinking about the other side of it and kind of the partnership side of it with the platforms. I mean, they're the kind of the two different use cases, right? There's the training use case where we're able to say, here's a bunch of content that you can use to train a model, and I think that it's been very useful for us. And I think some of the news organizations have managed to find a revenue stream there. But I think the interesting part of this is the one that you're kind of pointing to, which is the display use case. It's the real value of what we present as news organizations is news. It's what's new. It's not necessarily the archive is kind of a side effect of that. So I think that how we manage those relationships and how we manage that business model going forward is going to be extremely important. And I know there are a couple of different models coming up for how to be paid for that content, how to allow for scraping, or are there other ways? I think about the ways that we make our content available. Should it be scraping our site? Should it be, there are new protocols now. There's the model context protocol, right? So
Sure.
that can let agents, so we can say this is intended for an AI use case. Here's the best way to distribute that content. So I think there are ways that we can develop our distribution model that are suited specifically for AI use cases, and the kind of the how we measure that exchange, how we value that
Yeah.
has to evolve as well.
Yeah, and so I'm curious, it's probably early days for what you described, but the end of the day, you want to monetize that in some way, right? So, Have you? Well, what are your thoughts on that? Like, are you thinking about doing something similar to like a toll bid, where there is like, uh, besides just the straight up licensing, but this would be sort of a pay as you go thing that's more general for whoever shows up for the site, whoever being a news agent or an AI crawler.
Yeah, I mean, we don't have anything in production along those lines, but we're doing some experiments with it now, having a lot of conversations. And we're seeing, what the industry is changing so fast, the technology is changing so fast. What are the protocols, and what are the kind of value exchange monetization methods that you know, will become kind of the standard, right?
Mhm.
And so I think that's what we're trying to figure out now. What are the things that we should do? How we should structure this relationship? So we're talking to a bunch of people, and the revenue folks. I'm not on the revenue team anymore, but they're really thinking about this, like how we are monetizing this going forward.
So, switching tracks a bit, I know you guys had a partnership with Applied XL, Francesco Marconi's company, and it's something called Live Lead. Sounds really interesting. Can you tell me about that? What is Live Lead and how are you using it?
Sure, it's local lead.
Local Lead. Sorry.
And so, and that's important in that it's meant to take a big national data set and find the local stories in it. So one of the
Got
things,
it.
there's so much happening in Washington right now, and there is a data set in the Federal Register that captures a lot of that. And so we think about there are a number of data sets that kind of capture all this activity, but they're noisy. And so, how do we kind of find the newsworthiness, find the signal in that? And that's one of the things we worked with Applied Excel on is how to create essentially a news detection engine. So we can say, for example, with the Federal Register, a lot of this is incremental stuff that we would never write a story on. But some of these things are going to be extremely important, especially for certain areas. So if we find a local company that's mentioned, we find a federal, some federal lands that are going to be affected by a regulation, right? How do we extract that and then provide enough context to create a news tip? So it's essentially a news tip service that is, state by state. So we can say, what are things that are happening in the federal government that are important for your local audience? And here's why your local audience should care about this. The idea is not that these should be published directly. The idea is that it gets you a really far along in terms of understanding the story so that with a couple of phone calls, you can put out a story pretty quickly to say how this affects your community.
Nice. It sounds like a pretty very targeted way to you do the personalization stuff we were doing before. It sounds hard to scale though, given what you said earlier about it. Everything kind of needs any generative content would need to be vetted by someone. You need a human in the loop, right?
Right.
Um, do you find that that's a challenge with this in particular?
It is a challenge, because local news organizations are stretched, and they don't always have someone who can monitor this and run down these tips. And so that's some of the feedback that we've gotten. They really want us to be even more specific about the context, about the relevance for their audience. They want us to limit the noise there, and so that's something that we've been working on. Is really how do we get them closer to a story? We still don't feel comfortable saying this is ready to publish, right?
Yeah.
It's just in the nature of these models that we need that human oversight. But how close can we get them to having something that's publishable? That's really the goal here.
Do you ever envision a day where something, even if it's a simple summary or bullet points, um, be the AI and the process around it being good enough to go out without a check? What standard would it have to meet if that was the case?
Yeah, it's interesting. LLMs themselves, I don't know if they will get you there,
Mhm.
right? It's just the nature of the non-deterministic
Yeah,
model.
I say it all the time. Hallucinations seem inherent to the technology. Like it's they
Absolutely.
get better and more sophisticated, yet somehow hallucinations never go away, and they sometimes even get worse.
And the bigger reasoning models are actually
Yeah.
apparently introducing more hallucinations, right? So I don't think I think guessing is a feature, not a bug. That's what these things do. So, and they
Way to
don't
put
like
it.
to say I don't know. That is one of the things that we found. Like the LMs really don't like to say I don't know. But there's a lot of work being done around retrieval augmented generation to help reduce hallucination. And I think about,
Yeah.
there are new technologies. I was reading something recently about kind of knowledge graphs and world models, and how you can actually provide a world model that can instruct the LLM. So when we get to a point, I think in the news industry, our tolerance for inaccuracy is so low that it's hard for me to see the moment where we say, you know what, just flood the zone, throw it all out there. I
Right.
don't see it happening, but I do see it getting better and better. And one of the things that I'm interested in is, are there ways that we can let the models assemble already vetted material? So we think about the cutting room floor idea again. Are there things that are on the cutting room floor that we could say, this is vetted and approved and can be assembled in different ways by the model for a different user experience? I think I would be comfortable getting there sooner than removing the human from the loop altogether. I don't even know if that's desirable to
Mhm.
some extent, right? Because just there's so much value that the journalism, that the journalistic instinct and insight provides.
Right, exactly. It's like that's basically the product, once you take it out and then you're just left with algorithms. Yeah, I don't know, but at the same time I sometimes wonder if we're setting a higher standard for the machine than we even set for humans, right? Which is to say that humans aren't perfect either. They make mistakes. It's just the nature of the mistake is somewhat different. And does the nature of it matter, even if it's statistically lower, right? I think most people would agree that it does, even though they might not be able to articulate exactly why. So I think we're
It
kind of
does, but I
arriving at
think,
the same place.
yeah, but I think one key difference is that humans are accountable.
Yeah,
Machines aren't accountable, right? And so I think that's part of it. It's about trust. And, if we undermine trust, then we've lost our greatest value. And I think there have been enough hits to trust in the news industry over the last decade. We don't need to exacerbate that. So really thinking about ways that we provide that value. If we think about why our content is valuable to these models in the first place, a lot of that is that it's vetted, trustworthy material. And so that the accountability for the human in the loop, I think, is something we don't want to get away from.
absolutely. Just as we wrap up here, I'm curious, what would be the one piece of advice you'd give to another newsroom leader who's probably earlier on their AI journey than you are? What do they have to do to get AI adoption right? What's the number one thing?
I think one of the things I say to everyone asking about this is start with real world problems. I think that's one of the things that we did that was helpful, that we started with things that were already identified pain points. We didn't come in sort of with a hammer looking for a nail. We started by looking at what are the things that you're doing every day that you would like to do less often, or you'd like to spend less time on, right? And starting there and bringing in the newsroom, having them as part of the conversation for identifying the opportunities, iterating on the solutions, and approving. For us, if it doesn't pass the newsroom test, then it doesn't go into production. So having them part of that conversation all the way through and having them have the final say on whether it meets our standards, I think goes a long way toward building success.
Awesome. Well, that sounds like a great place to leave it. Troy, this has been great. Thank you so much for taking the time.
Fantastic. Thanks so much for having me.
Thanks for listening to my conversation with Troy Thibodeaux of the Associated Press. If you enjoyed this episode, I'd appreciate it if you'd take just a minute to leave a rating or review for the Media Copilot in your podcast app. Also, don't forget to subscribe to the Media Copilot newsletter and check out mediacopilot.ai for our classes on AI for journalists, PR professionals, and communicators. Be seeing you in the future.